Hello, you. The lighting's shit because my ring light broke. We fucking move. Joe was a background character in my life for a long time. My mum would watch the Netflix series You, and I would get sucked into random scenes, and I knew it was something that was up my street, but I'm really shit at watching TV shows that aren't cartoons. Then I read Hidden Bodies, which is the second book in the You novel series. But, we didn't have any of the others at the time, so this is the one that I read. And Joe in the book is so dissimilar to Joe in the show. I just knew that I had to watch it and do some comparative work. See what messages the show was construing as a result of said changes. The hat has to come off. I'm living in shadows. We're gonna talk about Joe and the differences between show Joe and book Joe, and talk about one of the main criticisms that I've seen about the show, which is that the changes that they have made redeem the bad guy. They redeem Joe. Joe's the bad guy, okay? This is something that we all need to remember. I think the thing that was most interesting to me personally is that the Joe that was presented to me in Hidden Bodies was this really unlikable character, this vulgar, rude guy who puts on this front in order to get what he wants in life, and what he wants in life is to manipulate the fuck out of a girl. I was really interested in the disparity between that and the Joe in the show, who is framed almost as a romantic hero and who is extremely likable and charming and also very, very attractive. It should be noted as well that although I did start off the series not liking Joe at all, but finding him quite compelling nonetheless, I love him now. I love book Joe. It doesn't hurt that we have a lot of the same opinions on certain things, and that, we're both book snobs. I find him really funny. I know that he is a bad guy, and I like him as a character, but also, if he, wasn't a serial stalker and murderer, I would probably be his mate. It's really actually quite distressing me how bad the lighting is, to be honest. So Joe in the book, the writing is really clever, okay, because he's a sociopath, right? So he's clever and charming, so even though he's unlikable, he's compelling. We see that he can, manipulate his way through these situations, and the Joe that we see inside of his head as the reader is really different to the Joe that he presents to the world in the book. In the show, like I said, Joe is almost framed as a romantic hero. He kind of gets himself into these scrapes where murder is the only way out, and it's framed almost as like quirky in a way. And we'll get a little bit into why later, but some people took umbrage with this because, they think to the uneducated viewer this could be an excuse to act like Joe. Worth noting that in the books, nobody really has much of a personality that Joe doesn't give to them or project onto them. So certain changes within the show were necessary just to make other characters more compelling, or, to add B-plot. If they were to stay completely loyal to the book, there would be a lot of Joe sitting around watching people's houses and stuff like that, which is not very interesting. So perhaps it's entirely possible that while making these changes, the writers forgot to think about how the changes would affect the narrative and the messages that were being portrayed by the narrative. The overall message of, you shouldn't stalk people and you should be careful about who you date. Let's talk about You, the book, versus You, season 1. The show opens up with Beck, Joe's love interest for the season, walking into the bookshop where he worked. We hear a little bit of his internal dialogue about her. They have a fun and flirty conversation. She leaves. We spend a little bit more time with Joe. I'm pretty sure we even get to see Paco, who's the little kid that he looks out for before all this. And it's only a little bit later on that it's revealed that Joe is a massive weirdo who turns up outside Beck's house to watch her through the window. It's an effective strategy on the part of the show to let us start to like Joe and identify with him before the reveal that he's a freak. A little bit of shock value, and it's fun and I like it. It really does set a precedent though for what they decide to cut out of Joe's character. I mentioned that we hear a lot of Joe's internal dialogue about Beck. What I didn't mention is that Joe's dialogue about Beck in the book is a lot more gross than his dialogue in the show, and that's because obviously they're waiting for the reveal that Joe is gross for later, whereas the book just kind of jumps straight into the fact that Joe's a massive freak. A lot of the sexual stuff that he thinks unsavory parts of his character are things that get cut out of the internal narration a lot, and they keep in him being clever and witty and all the romantic things that he thinks. Obviously it affects Joe's character a lot, and I can't believe that this is our, like, even in just the opening narration we can see that it's could have been an accident, but it feels like there was an agenda here to make Joe more likable, whether that be for the better or the worse. Joe, like a lot of the characters in this series, you'll come to find has been like cutesified in a way. Joe's also been given a more concrete backstory in the series, which again I don't disagree with. There was a need, as this is a visual medium, to flesh out the character a bit more in that respect, because we couldn't just have scenes of Joe sitting in a dark room thinking to himself about his backstory as it happens in the book. In the book, when Joe discusses his backstory, it is always, or almost always, about his past girlfriends, okay? Because that's the thing that Joe cares about the most, is finding love. Even if it's in this really fucked up way, that's what Joe really cares about. When we do find out things about his backstory, especially in this first book, he mostly talks about Mr. Mooney, who's the guy who owns the bookshop that Joe now works at. Joe's worked there since he was a teenager because he grew up with a shitty dad who didn't really care about him, and his mum wasn't around. So Mr. Mooney was like the most prominent male figure in his life, okay? The reason that we know all this is because Mr. Mooney is the guy who he talks about learning stuff from, and he doesn't really mention Dad a lot, just says that he was shitty. Really, Joe doesn't talk about himself a lot in the book, and we really just have to infer a lot of his backstory from the little things that he says. The show goes into a lot more depth with his backstory. They add in his mum and make it this whole thing where, like, he protected her from a shitty guy by killing him, and then like his mum like abandons him. It's implied, I guess, that the way that Joe is the way he is because he's always searching for his mum in people, and he's got this like fear of abandonment that makes him act out. This is a weird psychological thing that comes into it in the show that you just don't really think about in the book. Like, Joe's just a shitty weird guy in the book, and he's just like that because he's a sociopath, right? But Joe in the show isn't a sociopath. What you need to know about the mum backstory is like, it makes Joe more sympathetic as a character. So show Joe is like playing on our heartstrings, whereas like book Joe is just obsessed with talking about the women that he's been with in the past, and it makes him like sound like a proper misogynist, okay, which is why we don't like him, even though we do kind of like him. It's really complicated. Everyone's relationship with Joe Goldberg is very complicated, and we love that. Let's talk about Guinevere Beck. In the book, you can really see the disparity between the way that Beck is in real life and how Joe sees her. Okay, so Joe thinks of her as this really innocent girl thrust into this world of partying and stuff like that, and she's being manipulated by her situationship Benji, who's a shitty guy. We can see in like the scenes that we get of Joe watching Beck in her life that that's not really the way she is. She's just a very normal girl in the book, is Beck. She's got her little quirks and hang-ups that make the book interesting, like the shit with her family, but in herself, she's a very normal and relatable girl. She's got this situationship going on that she's obsessed with, but she doesn't let it get in the way of her, like, dating other guys, which is, she's perfectly in her right to do. In the show, I've seen it said a lot that they made Beck a slut, for lack of a better word. I don't know, like, she's really promiscuous, okay, to use this really fucking outdated term, okay? She has, like, random Tinder guys over and stuff, I'm pretty sure, in the show. It's also after she and Joe start to, like, talk to each other and start dating, and, you know, a lot of people would count this as cheating. That kind of makes Beck unlikable. It's a grey area, obviously, and the fact that we are aligned with Joe in the show and we're sympathetic to Joe in the show means that we see Beck doing that as cheating because Joe is so invested singularly in this relationship that he would never go out and date anybody else, right? We feel sorry for Joe and we see Beck as the villain, okay? And that's not good because, as we all know, Joe is definitely the villain here. Maybe this change was to emphasize the difference between how Joe sees Beck and how she really is. But obviously it kind of had an adverse effect because I think that of all Joe's love interests, Beck is probably the most universally hated. Joe gets all of her info online at the beginning of the show, so it kind of makes it Beck's fault for having all her information freely available and out there. In the book, he does go to a little bit more devious means to, like, find out who she is and where she lives and stuff. And obviously in the book it's very obvious from the beginning that Joe is a bad guy. Even if Beck did put all of her stuff online, you know, like a normal guy would never like use that to his advantage. So that's the way that we view it in the book, because Joe has very clearly been portrayed as the bad guy from the off. That's the real difference here. The show, with making Joe, with the framing Joe as this good guy at the beginning, even if it was just for shock value, really set themselves up for failure there. Everybody now thinks it's an issue that the stalker is a sympathetic guy. Is it an issue? Find out at 11. I did like the addition of the creepy TA guy in the show. It really added to the feminism of Beck's entire plotline, okay? And I don't want to get too heavily into that because we're doing a Joe Goldberg character assassination right now. This isn't about the feminism of the U series, which I could entirely do a video on now that I'm thinking about it, but appreciate the adding of the creepy TA because it at least showed that, like, Beck wasn't a slut, right? Like, she wasn't out to just be promiscuous with whoever. She had her morals and her standards, okay? And she wasn't going to sleep with this guy just for the chance to get some good grades or whatever the fuck was going on there. I don't understand the American school system. I mentioned Benji, who is Beck's situationship. She is, like, in love with him, I guess. He's, like, a playboy. In both the show and the book, Joe kidnaps Benji and keeps him in this cage that's in the book Strop's basement. I'm not going to explain the cage. I'm not explaining it. The show, it really feels like it was kind of an impulsive decision. And in the book, it felt a lot more calculated, okay? The whole having Benji in the cage thing. And I feel like even the murder of Benji in the show came about as like a result of, well, what's Joe gonna do? Let him go and let him tell everybody that he kidnapped him? He's gonna have to kill him. And plus, doesn't he like make out that he didn't believe him, that he was allergic to peanuts because he lied about everything else? The entire thing made Joe look like everything he did was like a crime of passion and he didn't really think about it beforehand, whereas in the book he seems like a very calculated guy who knows what he's doing and has in fact done this before. He does actually say that he's done this before to Candace's brother, and that is something that never comes up in the show. It never comes up again in the book, to be fair, that I can remember. It's this little hint at something that the show could have chosen to explore, but conveniently chose to leave out because Joe having kidnapped and murdered some girl's brother before does not bode well for the main character of your show being sympathetic as you have chosen to portray him. You see why I say it feels like they had an agenda here, and I don't know whether it was for good or for ill. There are reasons that making Joe's character more relatable and more likeable could be good for the message. Well, I want to get into that at the end when we've discussed all of the stuff that I've written down, okay? Another thing to note about Joe and Benji is that when Joe kills Benji in the show and he has to cut up his body, he throws up, which like shows this like sensitivity and also the fact that obviously he hasn't done this kind of thing before. This is like a new territory for him. It shows that it's something he doesn't want to do, right? And it just shows Joe's whole like martyr situation that he's got going on in the show where this stuff just keeps happening to him and he just keeps having to get rid of bodies. Like it's not his fault that these bodies are in his basement. About Benji personally, the show makes him a worse guy than he is in the book. In the book, he was just like a stuck-up rich arsehole who had his own company and was a bit of a snob. Obviously, he didn't treat Beck very well either. Boys don't deserve to die for that, unfortunately. One thing that they added in about Benji in the show to make him even more of a dickhead was that he like accidentally killed a guy in a hazing incident in college. I'm pretty sure that was entirely made up for the show. And this is something that you're going to notice is a theme about the show, is that like they take the people that Joe has to murder and they make them worse people so that it kind of feels like they're going for a Dexter situation where Joe is killing off bad guys, and so it doesn't really matter that he's a murderer because he's murdering like other murderers. Not the case in the book. He's just murdering him because he's shagging the girl that he fancies. Another person that Joe murders is Peach, one of Beck's friends, and she's like rich and she's got a bit of a crush on Beck, and I don't think Beck realises. Joe realises, obviously, because Joe's obsessed with Beck also. Revealed in both the show and the book that Peach is, you know, she's got a little bit more than a crush on Beck. She's a little bit obsessed with her, and she like takes naked pictures of her when she's asleep in her house and then like jacks off to him or whatever. In the show, they definitely upped Peach's psycho. And they made her a lot more an antagonist to Joe, and like even an all-out villain, I would say. When Joe is like breaking into her house and stuff to try and like expose her to Beck. But Peach like pulls a gun on him, and so he has to shoot her. Or he'll die. So they kind of make Peach's death self-defense, whereas in the book he just straight up kills her. there's no self-defense about it. He just kills her. Another thing that you will find the show doing is adding in younger characters for Joe to help out. In this season, it is Paco. He is a kid who lives next door, whose mum's got a shitty husband, and they fight all the time. And he like hits her and stuff. As a result, the kid's always sat in the hallway, and Joe like lends him books and gives him hot lunches. Makes Joe a lot more of a sympathetic character because we see him doing these nice things for this kid. Joe doesn't like get anything back from this. Like obviously the kid thanks him and stuff, but the dad like, starts harassing Joe because he doesn't want him to get too close. This selfless act, like you could have chosen anything else. Like you could have chosen for there to be a B plot about someone in need, but Joe could benefit from the situation, and so it still showed this sociopathic nature that he's got, right, where everything he does is for himself. But no, you chose to add in a hungry kid next door who Joe gives hot meals to. Something else I'll mention while we talk about the first season is Candace, because she is mentioned. We do see her death. Okay, and like spoiler alert, she comes back for the second season, so it turns out that Joe didn't even really kill her before the series started. We see her death, okay, and it's Joe has kind of kidnapped her. They're just kind of having a tussle, and he accidentally hits her head against something when he's shaking her, and she dies. It didn't have to be that way. Okay, it didn't have to be an accident. He could have meant to kill her, and she could still come back. The writers of the show chose to make Candace's death an accident, and I know that this makes us less certain about the fate of Beck, because obviously if Joe's killed a girl before on purpose, we've got no hope for Beck at that point, okay? Everything else combined with this, you can see the angle they're going for. It's like, oh, Joe's got himself into this situation before because he just loves too hard, okay? Why do all these women keep trying to leave him? It inadvertently makes him not guiltless, but it makes him less guilty of her death because he didn't mean it. See in this first series that the need for B-plots also serves this the dialogue that we're having about fucking de-villainizing Joe, and it only gets better in the second season because that's when we introduce Love fucking Quinn. So in Hidden Bodies, the second book, Joe literally moves away from New York to follow a girl, specifically to kill her because she stole from him. They don't do that in the show. He moves away to get over the heartbreak of killing Beck or whatever, which isn't any better, but okay. We meet Delilah, who in the book is an example of how Joe treats who he sees as low-value women, which is to say not very well. He uses Delilah for sex and then kills her, just kind of for no reason. I think kind of because he's embarrassed that he had sex with her in the first place, which is like, that's on you, Joe. In the show, they make Delilah this girl next door who wants to be a detective and got took advantage of this guy in her youth. Joe kind of ends up helping her as the show goes along in this big fucking feminist tirade that she has. Since Delilah is sympathetic now, instead of just this random side character, no, we couldn't have Joe now kill Delilah because, like, the audience cares about Delilah, and if Joe killed her, that would mean that they couldn't sympathise with Joe anymore. What they did instead was they had Love kill Delilah. Love is Joe's love interest for the second season and also the second book. They kind of reveal late on in the show that Love is also a fucking serial murderer person and also a bit of a stalker. And she kills Delilah. It gives us a good out later on to make Love the bigger villain so that Joe looks less bad in comparison. Joe gets another kid to protect in this series, in the form of Ellie, who's Delilah's little sister. He just right off the bat is like, no, I'm not out to protect this kid, like as if he just has this like urge to protect the children that he can't control. Why is he a superhero now all of a sudden? Ellie isn't in the book, but Henderson, the guy who is noncing her in the show, is in the book, and he's just a guy who slept with the girl that Joe wanted to sleep with, and so he like gets a fucking hate boner for him and kills him. Obviously, like I said, in the show they make him a nonce, so everybody wanted him dead anyway, and it's this whole Dexter thing again where they make Joe kill the bad guy so that Joe seems like a good guy, and the fact that he killed someone kind of doesn't matter now. for some reason. The cuteness factor of the whole cast has been real. Love in the book doesn't really get much of a personality. She really doesn't get as much as Beck did. It's actually kind of plain and a little bit boring. She's definitely the most boring of Joe's love interests. The same could not be said for her in the show. She's a lot more quirky and likable. And even when she's crazy, she's got this like feminist fantasy of going about murdering your husband. Or like maybe it's a country singer fantasy. Mad feminine insanity vibe to her that makes her really likable even after that. Delilah is made into this fucking junior detective and they've added in Ellie to raise the cuteness factor for Joe. Most egregious example of them upping the cuteness factor is in 40, who's Love's twin brother. 40 in the book is such an entitled arsehole and he's so unlikable and he's like stealing Joe's writing ideas to try and boost his own career. In the show, I like would take a bullet for that man. So cute and he's such an idiot. And, you know, this was obviously the point of the whole show. And so just like Delilah, Joe doesn't kill him. 40 gets shot by a police officer at the end. You know, in the book, he actually tries to kill 40 and doesn't succeed. He tries to like drown him in a hot spring or something. But in the book I didn't mind because 40 was such a fucking dick, to be fair. But in the show, if he'd have tried to kill 40, I would have thought Joe was a fucking knobhead. And he didn't do that. And so we can continue to sympathise with Joe, I guess. As long as he only kills the characters we don't like, Joe's cool, okay? It's weird that they left the wedding scene in the show for 40 because it really felt out of character for him. You know, the scene where he makes the newlywed bride make out with it. In the book, it really was the cementing scene for just how much of a fucking dick this guy was. Maybe the writers realised how likeable they were making 40. And they knew where the show was going and the fact that 40 had to die. So they tried to kind of shoehorn in this wedding scene in order to make us see him as the entitled arsehole that he was in the book. But he just was too stupid to really feel like anything that he was doing was intentional. And he was also getting manipulated by not just Joe, but Candace as well, who obviously came back in this season and couldn't come back in the book because she was murdered by Joe. You did just kind of see him as this really like gullible person in the show. They really just make it so Joe isn't a killer. Like, he kills people, but it's like he doesn't want to. Make the deaths like an accident or self-defense, or they make the guy or girl that he's killing a bad guy. Softens the blow of the fact that this guy is a fucking freak. As much as I'm gonna try and defend some of the other decisions a little bit later on, this is one of the things where I'm like, you didn't have to make him so sympathetic in order for him to be a compelling character. Clearly you didn't have to do that because the book doesn't do that. Joe's going around killing people left, right and centre. He doesn't care. He doesn't discriminate about whether we like them or if the fucking girl he's into likes them. He just be killing people. And yet I still want to read about him. And actually the more I've read about him, the more I've come to like him. I started out not liking him. So it's weird. It's weird that they decided to soften Joe in these ways when I feel like it would have been a lot more impactful to just have him fucking murder 40. I don't know. We'll move on to You Love Me, which is the third book and the third season of the show. There's a time jump in between the second and third book and shit happens in that time jump that in the show they combine with the events of the book to make it a little bit more interesting. And also they just make up a whole bunch of stuff. In the book, Joe's in love with a girl called MK. They kind of take MK in the show and split her into two different women. So at the beginning, Joe's into this woman who's already married. And then later on, he gets into the girl at the library, Marianne. This is so they could have the inciting incident be a murder. It's just really funny that that murder is not Joe. Again, it's fucking Love. Natalie is the woman who's married. And she kills her because she knows that Joe's obsessed with her. This is the season where they, you know, they make Love into this fucking insane woman who's like completely out of control and is just killing people for the most mundane reasons. And so Joe has to step in and stop her. It's the Dexter situation again, guys. And all the characters are kind of like made cooler or more cutesified. World view is kind of this dystopian world where everyone is a little bit more obsessed with technology than in the real world. And I think that's a reflection of how Joe is so disdainful of technology in the books. Makes us see the world a little bit more like Joe does. But everybody else just seems like a sociopath now, so it's hard for us to feel like Joe is the outlier in this situation, because everybody else is just as fucked as he is by this point in the show. One of the things that I thought was funny about like the cutesification of this book is that Marianne has a kid and they make the kid a toddler. But the kid that MK has in the book is like a difficult teenager who's obsessed with Columbine and tries to seduce Joe at the end. Maybe they just didn't want to rehash the Ellie plotline because in the third book there is this whole nonce situation with a guy called Seamus who's hitting on MK's kid. Obviously they had Henderson in series 2 of the show, so they probably didn't want to feel like they were talking about nonces all the time. Somebody might have thought something was up. Oh, speaking of nonces, they made love a nonce in this series. Listen, I don't know, I can't remember how old this kid is meant to be canonically, and apparently the actor is older than her in real life, but he looks so young, and he is a lot younger than her in the storyline of the series, okay? And Love just full on starts having an affair with this like college kid next door, and it's the fucking weirdest fucking thing. And that was the thing that made it like, okay, we've got to kill Love, Joe. The woman has got to go. She's riding around with kids on scooters and shagging them in park. She's got to go. They made her a nonce and they made her like an irrational killer who just kills people on fucking sight, essentially. Like somebody exposes a kid to chickenpox and she just kills it. She kills the guy for being an anti-vaxxer. It's great. You can't just go around indiscriminately killing people for silly little reasons, and so Joe has to get rid of Love. He's justified in doing that, but also we get to still keep Joe as a murderer and act like we're doing something deep here, I guess. I'm gonna confess something to you right now. I did not finish the 4th season of You, and that's because I saw the plot twist coming, and I just don't care how it plays out. I'm just like, I'm so done with it. Spoiler alerts, okay, it turns out that like Joe is 2 people. Like he's got like a split personality, and it does really just feel like they're trying to redeem him, because now it's like, oh, it wasn't even Joe that was doing that, it was this other guy that just so happens to live in Joe's head. And I know that that's not really how it works, but are they really going to try and bring out another series where they separate Joe's 2 personalities and he becomes like this good romantic guy and gets to be with a girl normally? Because if they do that, I'll bite someone. Let's not look at it from that angle, okay? Let's be positive and think about the fact that, did this twist totally redeem Joe? Or did we in this season get to see Joe the way that he really is? At the beginning of the series, I really thought it was going to do something, because obviously Joe finds a dead body on his table and he gets rid of it, thinking that he's had some kind of a fucking mental synapse break, killed a guy and not realised it when he'd had a drink. Then this number starts texting him and it turns out that he wasn't the killer, and now he's got a stalker who knows that he knows how to get rid of a body. Okay, so it's not good. And I thought the idea of Joe getting stalked was a really good idea for a season, like to turn it around on Joe and have him be the one who's getting followed. That's just not the way it went. And it turned out that Joe was like texting himself this whole time or some shit, I don't know. Because Joe was seeing the stuff that was happening as this like third party thing, we didn't get to hear Joe's like charming reasoning behind these murders that he committed, and as a result we saw them as the awful things that they actually were. And when it was revealed that it was Joe who had done these murders, it was like, oh, Joe's the guy who's done these awful things. So as a result, like, we finally got to see Joe from this third person perspective instead of being inside his head. Because like, maybe the show made Joe more likable and relatable. Doesn't that just make it all the scarier? Because I can say that Book Joe is a sociopath, right? But I know that I'm not a sociopath, so I know realistically I'm not going to start acting like Joe anytime soon. But I do see the parts of myself that are similar to Joe. Like I said, we're both book snob. You know, I can be a little bit obsessive in relationships, not to this point, but yeah, a little bit. So we can take that and we can learn little things about ourselves by seeing the extremes that Joe in the book presents. But Joe in the show is so much closer to a lot of us, that it makes the comparisons that little bit deeper and a little bit like more terrifying. I also think that the framing of Joe as a romantic lead in the show quite clever in a lot of ways, because as much as you can say it opens up for problematic readings of the show, it also parallels the way that the book takes place entirely inside Joe's head. So, in order to portray that in a visual medium, wouldn't you make the world seem as Joe sees it? In the same way that people in this world are a little bit more obsessed with social media to, emphasize Joe's points about why social media is bad. Why can't we see Joe's escapades as romantic ones, because that's how he sees himself. He sees himself as the romantic lead. One of the most famous quotes from the first season: "I've seen enough romantic comedies to know that guys like me are always getting into scrapes like this." And he's literally in Beck's shower. A really stupid and skewed vision that he has of the world, right? But that's the way that he sees it. So that's the way it's portrayed in the show. And yes, I am gonna compare you to Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Kubrick took the text that Anthony Burgess had wrote and he adapted it as he saw fit. Kubrick's adaptation of A Clockwork Orange, everybody said at the time, it supposedly like condoned violence and like encouraged it and like romanticized this violent lifestyle that the protagonist Alex was living. In the years since, we've obviously come to realize that not only is it a great fucking piece of cinema, but the film can tell us a lot about ourselves. Having villains in any piece, but especially having villains as your protagonist, is really important, because relating to and maybe even sympathizing with villains is how we learn not to be like them. We see the parts of ourselves that are similar to these people and we can choose to change those things. Indulging fantasy is fine. Like, maybe you're a jealous person who's dreamt about going murdering any guy that your girlfriend talks to, right? And Joe does that, so go and watch Joe do that instead of doing it yourself. As long as we acknowledge that that's what we're doing, as long as we always remember that Joe is the bad guy, that his behavior it is not something that should be held up as acceptable, right? And that we should not be emulating it. That the things that we have that are similar to him may not necessarily be good things, okay? As long as we always acknowledge that context, there's nothing wrong with any of this. There's nothing wrong with the book. There's nothing even wrong with the show. As much as we can say that certain things about it are problematic, like certain murders being omitted, in my opinion, who knows, maybe in like 20 years we'll be looking back on this as one of the great character studies of our time. Yeah, this has been me talking about Joe Goldberg. I do love the first few seasons of this show, even if I wasn't happy with the way that this last one turned out. And I do absolutely love the books. I would recommend them to anybody, especially if you like the show. I think that to sit down and read the book is to sit down with Joe. Carolyn Kepnes is so good at getting inside of Joe's head. And like I said, even if you don't like the Joe in the book as much as you like the Joe in the show, he is nonetheless a very compelling and interesting character. Dare I say, he is even fucking charming. We love Joe Goldberg in this house. And, yeah. I'll see you next time,